To bring this afternoon to a close, it gives me great pleasure to invite my friend and colleague, Anna Mihaylov, to introduce and to have a conversation with my other friend and, in many ways, intellectual mentor, Professor Stephanie-Kelton, who, amongst many other things, is a professor of public policy and economics at Stony Brook University, remains, as she was in the previous campaign, the senior economic advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders, and is also, at the moment, the visiting Harcourt professor at the University of Adelaide. So please welcome Stephanie and Anna for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I might do a bit more of an introduction of Stephanie. I'd like to welcome her to the conference and thank her for coming. Stephanie is, of course, a leading expert on modern monetary theory, which you have heard about today. This is a new way of looking at how money, the macroeconomy, and economic policy works. She's extremely influential in both academia and politics, serving as the chief economist on the US State Budget Committee and as the senior economic advisor to Bernie Sanders. She's currently professor of economics at Stony Brook University. Her forthcoming book, The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and Creating an Economy for the People, shows how to broaden the debate around policy making and government expenditure in the economy. In addition to her many academic publications, she's a contributor to the public economic debate, writing for Bloomberg, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, CNN, and others. Thank you so much for being here today, Stephanie. I think I speak for myself and for the audience in saying that we look forward to gain insight into how the MMT lens, the way of seeing the world through MMT, has implications for government policy and specifically in addressing ecological sustainability. Please join me in welcoming Stephanie. So I'm going to make the assumption that most of you are non-economists, and if I'm mistaken in that, please forgive me, but I'm going to ask a really, really basic question. What is the MMT lens? Because Bill was talking about the fact that MMT is a way of seeing the world, a way of seeing how things are actually happening right now. And more specifically, what insights does this lens have for how government spending and government debt work in the real world?
Well, thank you very much. This is an incredible turnout. So I understand that you had an opportunity already to get an introduction to MMT, and so in many ways I hope this is familiar terrain. And what I'm about to say, I was doing a radio interview or something and wasn't able to be here when Bill was speaking earlier today. But, you know, to use the phrase lens, to use the term a lens, okay, think about what that means. I look around, I see many people wearing lenses, right? So what MMT tries to do is to give us an updated prescription, essentially to say that in many cases, economics is still taught and economists still write their theories, their models, put forward their ideas in the context of a framework, a set of lenses that's not appropriate for the modern era, hence modern monetary theory. So what does that mean? Basically that after 1971, something really significant happened. And what happened is that the international monetary system changed. We had an international monetary system that was put in place in 1944 after the war, put together in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, a system where countries came together and agreed to fix their currencies to one another and through the US dollar to gold. So it was a gold standard, right? Convertible currencies, and that kind of a monetary system imposes a certain set of constraints on governments when it comes to their ability to run their domestic policies, their monetary policy through their central banks, and their fiscal policy through Congress and parliaments. How much policy space was available to them was different from the policy space that is available to most countries today. operating with a different monetary system in place, one where currencies are no longer convertible into gold or anything else, but instead are free-floating currencies, and where countries largely refrain from borrowing in currencies that they can't issue. So MMT is focused especially on the set of countries that fit the criteria that they issue. They are the issuers of a non-convertible fiat currency. Countries like the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, right? Japan, and so forth, that these countries have opened up policy space around them, but have largely failed to recognize it. And so in many ways, they still operate their macro policies, fiscal and monetary, as if they were still hamstrung by a gold standard or a fixed exchange rate system. So MMT is trying to say, hang on, right? There is more policy space than you think, and because you are the issuer of the currency, you face no pure financial constraints. Governments that can issue their own currency can spend without the need to tax or borrow in advance to raise revenue to finance their spending. And from that, a whole bunch of additional stuff follows.
So in the Australian political debate, especially in the last election, talking about government fiscal responsibility and running a budget surplus and paying for all the programs we want to enact, how does MMT look at that type of discussion?
Well, see, it's interesting because you use the key phrase, the magic words, paying for, right? We're already paying for it. All governments that operate with their own sovereign currencies, like I just described, that fit that criteria, pay for their spending by authorizing the budget. They appropriate funding. Congress, in our case, says this year we're going to spend $4.5 trillion. That's what we're committed to. Once Congress commits, or a parliament commits to a budget or commits to spending money, it's paid for. Okay, what happens next is that the central bank carries out those payments by crediting the appropriate bank accounts. If we contract with a big defense contractor like Lockheed Martin, then a great big number shows up in Lockheed Martin's bank account. If we instead make a commitment to fund healthcare or education or do a Green New Deal, then the appropriate bank accounts will be credited. And so it's already paid for. The loaded term, paying for, I know this from my time as the chief economist on the US Senate Budget Committee, what's usually meant is that you don't add to the deficit. That's what people mean when they say, how are you going to pay for it? They mean, do you have a plan to offset every new dollar of spending that you're proposing? So if you want to spend on a Green New Deal or healthcare or whatever, how are you going to pay for it means show me your blueprint, show me your plan to rip a dollar out of some other part of the economy so that the amount of money you're spending in is equal to the amount that you're taxing or cutting from some other part of the budget so that we aren't adding to the deficit. That's what they mean by paying for. But you can pay for things without fully offsetting new spending. And that's one of the critical points that MMT tries to bring, is when and why you need the offsets and what kinds of offsets.
Sure. So we're going to talk about, whether there's a revenue constraint on spending or whether there's a different constraint. We'll get to talking about inflation as the constraint. But I wanted to go back a little bit and maybe draw some parallels with Keynesian economics. And my apologies to the economists in the audience. I'm going to try and summarize it really succinctly. During the Great Depression, John Maynard Keynes revolutionized the way we think about economics. He changed a previously held belief that free markets are self-balancing and always go back to full employment. He spoke about changes in aggregate demand driving business cycles, and therefore for a role existing for government and for fiscal policy, which is changing government spending or taxation, to come in and balance out the business cycle to reduce unemployment. So with that in mind, can you talk a little bit about the differences between Keynesian economics, the differences and similarities between Keynesian economics and MMT?
Yes. Well, for Keynes himself, the great man, right, Keynes was talking about, a situation where conditions were extremely depressed, right? We were in a Great Depression. So when Keynes puts forward, the general theory, the idea being that the government, and really only the government, was in a position to spend when incomes were collapsing. The government can spend counter-cyclically, where the rest of us, we spend more when our incomes go up, and then we tend to spend less when our incomes fall. So Keynes said, look, you've got to have essentially fiscal stimulus, right? And the government can provide that to pull the economy out of the doldrums. But what followed Keynes is Keynesian economics, and I'm going like this for a reason, right? If there are no children in the room, I will say bastardized version of Keynes, where many of the most important, perhaps all of the most important insights were really left behind, and they put forward a different version that might smell a little like Keynes, but really didn't bring along the core insights. And so what you get are arguments from people who say, well, when an economy isn't doing well, right, when the economy turns down and unemployment begins to rise, there may be a role for fiscal policy, right? Normally, the central bank can handle it all. You just let the monetary authority deal with any slowdown in the economy. They'll cut interest rates. It gets cheaper to borrow money. People will borrow, and if they take up enough credit and start spending, the economy will recover. If and only if something goes wrong, then you look to the fiscal authority to juice it a little bit, right? Some short-term stimulus. Sometimes economists refer to it as pump priming. You just got to kind of, the car runs low on gas, you give it a little extra boost, and off it goes, right? And then you can back off, and it'll run on its own back toward a full employment equilibrium. So that's Keynesian. Mm-hmm. Now, MMT has a more unapologetic approach when it comes to fiscal policy. It's not the thing that sits on the wall with the break glass in time of emergency cover on top of it. We're prepared to use fiscal policy to permanently sustain full employment and not to become dependent on central banks. Because how does monetary policy work? By driving people into debt. That's how monetary policy works. You change the interest rate in the hope that people will borrow, and borrowing means debt. And so private sector debt builds up. And yes, for a period of time, that can support an economy through an expansion. But beyond some level, you and I, we're not currency issuers. We're users of the currency. And at some point, the debt service can become too much for some of us. A business can take on too much debt. Households take on too much debt. And so we, I think, have just leaned way too heavily on central banks for about the last 30 years to engineer the conditions to support a healthy economy, and we get bubbles, and then those bubbles collapse, and then we have an ensuing recession, and then we rinse, wash, repeat, right? So MMT is saying there's a safer way to do this. Monetary policy works by driving people into debt. Fiscal policy works by driving income into people. You own it, as Jamie Galbraith puts it, you own the cash free and clear. So a permanent stabilizing role for fiscal policy.
Sure. And there's a lot in the media around MMT being connected with just printing money to pay for what we want. And there's a lot of misquoting, I think, of MMT. But I'm going to play the devil's advocate and ask you a question that maybe you've heard before. Are you advocating for large and sustained budget deficits financed by printing money? And won't this be inflationary? Won't it cause inflation in the economy?
No, and, well, I can't answer the last part because the first two answers are no. So, no, I'm not advocating for any particular budget outcome in advance. I don't know, sitting here today, what the appropriate budget outcome for the Australian government is 2 years hence, 5 years down the road, 10 years from now. It depends on what economists would call demand leakages, or the state of the economy at that future point. I would never sit here today and say, 3 years from now, the government's budget should be a 1% surplus. How in the world would I know whether the economy is going to be in a depressed state 3 years from now, whether it's going to be, in a massive explosion of growth and government budget should be more restrained at that point? So MMT does not target any particular budget outcome. The goal is to balance conditions in the broader economy. The goal is to achieve full employment, maintain low inflation, broadly equitable distribution of income. So we have this today, right? That's an unbalanced economy. If you can use the government's budget to rebalance the economy, and you end up with this, I don't care whether the government's budget looks like this. Maybe taxes are this, down here, and spending is up here, and I have a deficit. But if that deficit produces a broadly balanced economy, I'm perfectly happy to call this a balanced budget, because it's achieving the proper goals, which are to balance the broader economy. Real outcomes, human outcomes, environmental outcomes. Those are the things that matter, not the budget outcome. Did I answer both parts of your question?
Yeah, and I guess the follow-up, and from my understanding, MMT is actually looking at inflation in a much more proactive way, because it's looking at the potential for inflation when enacting fiscal policy rather than using monetary policy or interest rates to adjust for it after the fact. So I guess I wanted to prod and ask, how does MMT approach the inflation risk caused by government spending?
So I was saying to you on the walkover, we walked over together, and I had just finished writing a very short, which it turns out is much harder to write than something long, right? The old joke, I would have written something shorter, but I didn't have enough time. They asked, a Swiss newspaper wrote a few hours ago and asked for 300 words. And the prompt, they're going to have another person respond to the same question, and they put this question to me, and the question was, should governments print money and solve problems? Should governments print money to solve problems? That was the question. Should governments print money to solve problems? Now, you can imagine my 300-word dilemma. So I approached it through the MMT lens, and that's how I started the piece. I'm going to respond to this through the lens of MMT. So there is no should governments print money. There's only one way to spend. It isn't as if there's a choice here. Okay, all government spending is carried out via governments authorizing expenditures and central banks clearing those payments. That's the only way it works. And so, in a sense, you could say all government spending is already carried out through the creation of new money. New, if you like, bank reserves are created and new bank money in the process. There is no other way to do it. The question then becomes, since there's only one way to spend, why not just print? Why not just create all the money to solve all the problems in the world? That'd be great, except you can't do it, right? Because there are limits. And the limits are in the real economy. There are ecological and environmental limits. There are also real capacity constraints. You only have so many people. Once you hire them all, how are you going to do more? Right? You only have so many factories. You only have so many machines inside those factories. You only have access to so many raw materials. And you probably shouldn't use them all, right? As we were hearing in the last session. So every economy has its own internal constraint, right? You have a real resource constraint. And if you try to push spending beyond those capacity constraints, you're going to create an inflation problem. Not just government spending, but any additional spending in an economy that is close to full employment will give rise to price pressures, right? So the answer I gave was that when you're in depressed conditions, like when Keynes was writing the general theory, then it is safe to allow the government to spend, to move real resources from unemployment and make them employed resources to do productive things to serve the public good. I use the opportunity to say there is no greater challenge than the climate crisis right now. And so governments should use all the power at their disposal to address those problems, to solve those problems. But you have to do it in a way that is mindful and respectful of where those resource constraints are so that you're mitigating inflation risk along the way.
And I'll ask in more detail about how you do that, but I think it's, now that we've canvassed a little bit what MMT is and isn't, maybe let's get into talking about ecological sustainability and the environment. In a New Yorker article from last year, you're quoted as saying that MMT would form the basis of a new approach to policy making in which our political imagination is broadened. Can you talk about how an understanding of MMT can broaden the political discussion around climate change, ecological sustainability, etc.?
Well, I can try. And I'm going to try again on Sunday, on the last day of this conference, but just as a short, truncated teaser, I guess, to the way I think about this stuff. Because of the focus, MMT's focus on real resources. I think when you hear talk about, climate change, inevitably dealing with climate change involves a lot of money, spending a lot of money, right? In the US case, the Green New Deal, right? The most ambitious plan that we have in the US is a proposal that Senator Sanders is championing. It is on his website. You can look at it. It calls for the spending of $16.3 trillion to transform the U.S. economy away from fossil fuels to sustainable energy and energy efficiency. But it ain't just an energy plan, right? It's an opportunity to address other crises in our economy: inequality, homelessness, joblessness, a lack of health care. So they're taking climate crisis and using it as an opportunity to do so much more, right? To build millions and millions of new homes, sustainable homes, right? To transform the way we move around, transportation, the way we eat, agriculture. So it's a big, big program. So an MMTer is confronted, let's say, with this price tag of $16.3 trillion. It isn't about, for us, figuring out where to come up with $16.3 trillion. Okay, we've just learned that's the easy part. It turns out that's the easiest part of the whole exercise. So what I've done, and I started doing this sometime last year, is putting things out. I like Twitter for whatever reason. I find it a useful communication tool. And I started trying to say to people, the way to think about this is the way that Keynes approached the question of how to pay for the war. And so I went back to his little book, which was called How to Pay for the War. And judging by the title of the book, you might think, rightly, that this little book is all about where to come up with the money to pay for World War II so that Britain could fight the war. And it turns out that ain't it at all. It is not about where to get the money. It's how to manage the nation's real resources through the transition, because you had to take an economy that was oriented around producing for consumers and transform it into one that was oriented around producing for the war effort. You had to do it on short notice, right? It wasn't like, oh, we have years to plan for this. You had to act quickly. And it was a major, you understand the scale of what was involved. And Keynes just lays it out beautifully. It is an assessment of, first question, what are our real resource needs? What are we going to need? Right? It's like, how many aircraft carriers or bombers or, uniforms, meals ready to eat, the real stuff. What are we going to need? And what do we already have access to? Good news was depressed conditions. You had a lot of free available resources. And then once we run out of resources, how do we get the rest? How do we carry out this massive spending program in a way that contains inflationary pressures as best we can? That's the book. That's the book. And so I feel like the Green New Deal, dealing with climate, is a transformation of that order of magnitude. It's on a scale similar to the war mobilization, and that we should approach it the way that Keynes would have had us think about it back then.
Yeah, I might ask you in a bit more detail, I guess, the scenario of the practical implications of this. Imagine the Australian government made the political decision and had the political space to say, look, we want to pursue a Green New Deal. According to MMT, what process would they go through to determine how much government spending they could do in the economy to not be inflationary, so how much fiscal space they had. What would be the process that they would go through?
Well, I think, again, that it's one that mirrors the approach that was taken during the war effort and after the war. Because it turns out economists were pretty useful back then. That you could actually call upon them to come in and give you really useful insights. And so what you want to do is get an assessment. If the constraint, the relevant constraint is real resources, and you're worried about managing real resources to contain inflationary pressures, then what do you have to know? You have to know where the limits lie. So you can't take out I can give you a new lens, but I can't give you a set of binoculars that will help you see iceberg ahead. There it is, right? You know exactly where the thing is. You can't see the real limits. You can only get a sense of where they are. So what kinds of things might you look at to figure out whether an economy is approaching, and not just at the aggregate level, but in certain industries, because you can have inflationary pressures through bottlenecks and so forth forming and then bubbling up and creating inflation, even if there's slack in some other parts of the economy. So you need very smart people. You need to bring in, as they did then, labor leaders. You need to bring in industry, business leaders, economists, statisticians. You need a lot of smart people giving a lot of information and feedback to allow governments to figure out, right? I'm running out of capacity in this area. Now is not a good time to ramp up the housing piece. Maybe we have to slow down the housing building piece because that's starting to put a strain in steel industry, and you get the picture, right? So that's what we did then, and it worked remarkably well. We did not hyperinflate the economy. The U.S. government went from spending a very small percentage of total GDP, 5% of total GDP, up to about 50% in a matter of a year, right? Just took over essentially half of the economy and managed to do it without causing an inflation problem. We're smart. We're not dumb. We can actually do these things.
So I guess to summarize, it's about determining whether you've got the fiscal space, the capacity in the economy, rather than whether you have the dollars, because that...
Yeah, I mean, you're going to make mistakes. It's going to be imperfect. But what's the alternative? The planet's on fire. So maybe we're going to get 4% inflation along the way. Maybe it'll go higher, but it sure seems to beat the alternative. So mistakes will be made. And we are going to do the best that we can to identify limits and to, restrain spending as appropriate. But we shouldn't let the fear of an additional percentage point, I don't think, of inflationary pressure stop us from doing what needs to be done to keep emissions where they need to be to stop the worst of the climate effects from happening.
And I guess through talking to you, because the main criticism against MMT is this potential for inflation, hearing you speak makes me think, well, it's actually a more responsible approach to inflation because you're considering it at the policy level rather than leaving it up to the central bank to change interest rates, which doesn't always address the problem at the right time. I have a question about the job guarantee scheme, but I might leave it to you to ask if you have any questions because we discussed it earlier. And I'll finish off with asking I guess the last question. You've been really, I guess, effective in raising the profile of MMT. In your opinion, what's kind of next in promoting MMT? What do we have to do? How do we change the preconceptions that we have in this country and other economies about fiscal responsibility and the government living beyond their means and surpluses? What do you think we need to do to actually push MMT forward and allow this spending to happen?
Well, events like this one are absolutely important. Bringing people in, the last thing in the world I want to do is preach to the choir. So I rarely accept a speaking invitation where I know that I'm going to walk in and find an audience of people who already, have this stuff down pat. That's not a good use of my time. But to do events like this, to write books, to write op-eds, to go on radio, to go on TV, I work for a guy whose kind of catchphrase is, change never comes from the top down. It always comes from the bottom up, right? And I believe that. So we're not going to get where we need to be by reaching out to the Prime Minister, having a good meeting, and then expecting everything to change, or the next president for that matter. It's going to come from people power. It's going to come from enough people gaining an understanding that allows them, when confronted with a politician and you go, you know what, why aren't you doing more about the climate crisis? Why aren't you doing more? And they say, listen, we would love to, but we got this deficit. And now you've empowered enough people to stand up and say, don't you give me that. Don't you give me that. Your deficit is my surplus. Don't tell me that my surplus is stopping you from doing what needs to be done, right? So it's going to take time, and a lot of us have been at this for a lot of years, but I think we're really at the precipice of a kind of floodgates opening up for us, where maybe, just maybe, we're going to see a real shift in the national and international debates.
Yeah, if we're not talking about how to pay for it, we can talk about what we actually want to pay for and have those debates.
When we win, exactly. I sometimes will say to people, you know, sometimes people say, well, how will you know when you've won? For whatever that means. My answer is, when a politician goes on television and sits down for an interview and has a big, ambitious program that they've gotten behind, and the interviewer says, how will you resource it? Then I'll know that we've won.
I would ask more questions, but I found in my experience that your questions are far superior to mine, so I'm going to put it out to the audience. Yeah, go ahead, thank you.
Okay, it looks like I've got the nod.
Speaking.
I'm over here, way over here
on
your right. It's hard to see us all in the mass. My question is about how and whether MMT can address the problem of containing the future consumption of natural resources. And I ask it from the perspective of the idea that, for example, through the Green New Deal, the promotion of renewable energies will involve the extraction of many new forms of rare earths, etc. And whether it may be that we reach a point where there's a peak supply of those rare earths, or alternatively, or in addition, the extraction of those rare earths will have a major impact on biodiversity again, as we've seen with other forms of extraction. I haven't yet heard anything in the explanation of MMT today that actually speaks specifically about the issue of consumption, which, as Paul Ehrlich pointed out, is one of the three factors that are driving collapse.
Well, okay. I'll answer the question. I want to preface all of my remarks by saying I am neither a climate expert nor an environmental economist, and I have limits. My limits are real, and there are constraints in my knowledge. But, you know, going back to Keynes and the How to Pay for the War book, yes, you can definitely target consumption, and that was a big part of what was happening at in that period, because governments needed to ensure that the real resources were available to them, and in order to do that, they had to make sure that they depressed consumer spending enough to allow the government to take resources. Now, you're saying, I think, and this is way beyond my pay grade, that if we're thinking about transitioning to clean energy, and that in part requires intensively using raw materials and doing extractive things, then are there ways to discourage that? Sure, through the right policy making and through, I guess, alternatives, you know, not doing that. Do I know how to design climate policy to avoid that? No, I don't. But I'm sensitive. I appreciate that. I mean, I know batteries, everybody says, you know, we just need to find ways to have store wind and have, you know, batteries, and I understand that that has its own kind of problem. So I don't know the solutions. I'm sensitive to it.
Jeff Harcourt, first of all, can I say how delighted
It's not on.
Oh, I see.
There we go.
Okay, for my next number. First of all, can I say how delighted I am to see Stephanie again. She was a student of mine, 86, 87, and one of the joys of being a teacher is seeing how surpassed you are by your former pupils.
Right.
Do you think that implementing a sensible permanent incomes policy fits into the theoretical structure of MMT and is complementary to the other policies that you've been and other people today have been talking about?
Okay. So a permanent incomes policy, or I think what's often referred to as a universal basic income, a basic income.
Australia was most successful. We adjusted through the centralised wage setting system. We adjusted money incomes by the rise in overall productivity plus prices, and that gave us an environment of real income increases, which provided an agreeable return for going in for, in effect, money wage restraint.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad you clarified, because that's different from what I thought you were asking. So I could imagine that being a very successful program relative to what you had before then, for sure, or now. I think that MMT tries to do a little bit better. And the reason I say that is because it sounds, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, this is a policy that benefited people who were employed, who had a wage that could then be adjusted. As the late, great Hyman Minsky, who was one of the economists that I admired from the last century a great deal, as Minsky used to say, in the U.S., the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. But Minsky always said, no, it's not. The federal minimum wage, the minimum wage in the U.S. is zero, because that is the wage you earn if you are unemployed. It is zero. So that policy would work great, and presumably did work great, for people who had jobs. And what MMT tries to do is to say, why don't we ensure that everyone has a job? And that we do, as you mentioned, and probably Bill did earlier today, through the adoption of a program that guarantees a right to employment for all people. And then through that, there are ways that if you think that the economy, that workers need an extra boost, then you can move the wage in the job guarantee pool up, and then other wages presumably rise in concert. But different ways to try to address the problem of wage stagnation, or to allow workers to enjoy and share in the benefits of rising productivity.
So that's the employed buffer stock that Bill was talking about. And how does that act as an automatic stabiliser, the job guarantee scheme?
Well, so right now, when the economy goes through its inevitable business cycle, when the economy slows down and businesses see customers disappearing, and they see their inventories rising because demand has fallen off, they respond not by telling everybody to just, work a little bit slower, but they say, I don't need you. So they lay people off. And so right now we allow businesses to lay off workers, and those workers become unemployed. In the U.S. case, you get a little bit of unemployment compensation, you apply for it, you only get it for so long, and then it runs out, and then, you try to figure something out, move back in with the family. Sometimes people stay unemployed for a very long period of time, and then they become unemployable because employers don't like to hire people who don't have a work record, and so MMT says, why don't we deal with the problem of the economic business cycle by allowing people, when businesses lay them off, to remain employed? And so we accomplish that by having the government fund a program that is locally administered, that allows people to find work in public service employment, stay employed through the business cycle. That truncates the downturn, by the way, because people have income, and the incomes are supported at a higher level, and that restores business confidence sooner. Businesses then hire workers back, and they transition back into the private sector. So that's the automatic stabilizer. They become, the economy gets weak, people fall into the employed buffer stock, and as the economy recovers, they transition out, and the budget right-sizes itself through the inevitable ups and downs of the business cycle.
Great. I might just go a little bit to the back. The gentleman in the green.
My question is, why do you think governments are struggling to implement these frameworks such as modern monetary theory and the job guarantee?
Okay, well, first, MMT, I want to be a little careful here, or a lot careful, about implementing MMT. Okay, if I say MMT, you started by saying MMT is a lens. So do you feel like you've implemented something when you put your, yeah, right? It's a lens. So an MMT is not a prepackaged set of policy proposals that you hand a government and say, now go do MMT. It's meant to be overwhelmingly a descriptive analysis. It's a descriptive framework. It's a description of how monetary operations, right, how government spending already works, how the monetary operations. Now, it is true that in addition to that descriptive component, which is this big, there is a prescriptive piece. And that is true of every economic school of thought with which I have ever come into contact, okay? There's always a prescriptive piece. Even laissez-faire is a policy prescription, okay? So the MMT prescriptive piece includes a proposal that we can do better than allowing the unemployed to remain unemployed through the business cycle, that we can have an employed buffer stock. That's a prescriptive piece. And you're asking why governments haven't done more to take advantage of these insights, I think, and maybe also the policy piece. Fear of voters, I think. They have conditioned us, like Pavlov and his dog. They have conditioned us over generations to respond negatively to the idea of a government deficit. So every public official gets up in front of their constituents and says, vote for me and I'll add to the debt. No, they don't. They say, vote for me and I'll balance the budget or deliver a surplus or pay down the debt or whatever they think that we want to hear, you know? And that's why I say until we make that change, I don't see a lot of politicians. Now, there are a few in the US who will go on television and on a major national television interview get asked, how are you going to pay for that? Or how are you going to pay for it? And respond that in part we can pay for it with deficit spending. We have at least one who will say that courageously. But that's one, right? We need a lot of more. We need a lot more who will do that. And I just think the pressure has to come from us. Now, on the job guarantee piece, really super quick, because I know you probably want other questions or else we're done. Argentina did a version of a job guarantee years ago after the crisis. They floated their currency. They went off the peg, floated the currency, defaulted on some US dollar denominated and other debt, defaulted, and opened up policy space so that they could adopt a version of a federal job guarantee. They didn't make it available to all Argentinians. They said you had to be head of household in order to enter the program, but it worked incredibly well. They employed millions and millions of people very successfully until a conservative government came and chopped the whole thing up. In India today, still, after years this thing's been going, an employer of last resort program, they call it. It targets jobs to rural parts of the country, so it's not open to everyone in India, but in the rural communities. It's been up and running for a number of years, so it isn't as if it hasn't been done. Versions are so, and we have, of course, presidential candidate now running with the federal job guarantee on his presidential platform. So maybe.
Just one more question. Over here. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting pointed to. Did we get a woman? Did we get a woman? Just over here, this lady here. Thank you.
Right. Now, I'd like to challenge the idea that Keynes offers a model. And this is because Keynes was applied in a situation of war between nations. Now, all day I've been waiting for somebody to say, we cannot solve the climate change crisis at a national level.
Of course.
That this is a global problem. That the emissions from our burning of fossil fuels, they don't stay over Australia waiting for the Australian economy to be solved. They go right round the world and combine with emissions from every country in the world. And the solution also has to be global. Now, there is the question, does this create does a global economy and a global crisis and a global environmental issue create quite need for quite different approach to the one that looks at the economy and the government as series of self-enclosed questions.
Well, I'm glad that you raised it, because I thought that in my remarks, and maybe I'm getting confused because I've done several interviews before this one today, so maybe I said it somewhere else and thought I just said it here, or at least intimated, that when I said dealing with the problem on the scale that reflects the challenges we face, I meant we as in all of we, right, globally. And yes, you're absolutely right. It would do virtually no good to have Australia or the US move forward with an ambitious climate change agenda if the rest of the world was going to continue with business as usual. Keynes's book, however, served as a blueprint not just for the British government, but the US Treasury. You can go read the US Treasury writing notes, internal memos saying, hey, this guy seems to have this thing figured out over there. And while the US entered later, they used Keynes's approach to manage inflation risk when it became time for the US to transform its own economy into a war economy. So the blueprint, I think, works perfectly well for Australia, for the US, because it reminds us that what matters are the real constraints and managing inflation risk. So someone's waving.
Thank you. Could we give Stephanie a big thank you?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much for everybody for today. The great news is that you'll have a chance to hear from Stephanie again on Sunday. So if you missed out on the opportunity to ask her a question now, you can perhaps ask it then. Tomorrow, amongst the other highlights, we've got Bill Mitchell unveiling his Just Transition framework, and we've got Phil Lorne talking about the Genuine Progress Indicator. There are many others. Then on Sunday, of course, there will be Robert Costanza talking about natural capital, the leading ecological economist in Australia, and Stephanie is going to close out our conference talking about a Green New Deal.